Hi, fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mach, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Last week I made the claim that Merlin is perhaps the one and only wizard. And that was when I was discussing the definition of a wizard and comparing a wizard to a witch. If you've been listening to the show since episode 1, you'll know that I've already touched on the figure of Odin, known in English mythology as Wōden, W-O-D-E-N. He's the old Norse god that's associated with wisdom, healing, sorcery and knowledge. I'm especially interested in Wōden in his guise as a wandering magician, although he is a shape-shifting character so he can move from one thing to another. But he's often imagined as a wandering magician with a large hat, wide brim over one eye so you can't see the other eye, long black cloak and a staff in his hand. As you probably are aware, J.R.R. Tolkien's fiction was very much influenced by Norse mythology and even Norse history, and it seems that Gandalf, the wizard, was inspired by the figure of Wōden. Wōden is also Mr. Wednesday in Gaiman's American Gods. So this Norse god shapeshifter is, as I said, most usually depicted as a one-eyed, long-bearded, white-haired old man who's frequently armed with a spear or a staff, and he wears a dark cloak and a broad hat that hides his face. Wōden is normally accompanied by animals and birds that he talks to, and he rides across the sky on Old Slippy. And if you want to know what Old Slippy is, he's an 8-legged flying horse. But I ought to have pointed out last week that Merlin, who I described as the once and future wizard, is most likely either an incarnation, artificial or otherwise, of Wōden, the Norse god. Because Wōden, the Norse god, is the archetypal wandering magician. Yet Wōden himself is far older than Norse deity. The Romans knew of such a person. They described a figure very similar. And it's possible, in fact, that we should look even further back into history, perhaps back to the Proto-Indo-European pantheon of gods. So let's quickly talk about these people, the Proto-Indian Europeans. These are the first prehistoric people of Europe. They lived about 4,000 years ago in an area we know as the Ukraine and Eastern Russia. And the Proto-Indian Europeans were farmers and fisherfolk, and they lived in a climate with winter snow, and they invented the wheel and the plough, and they domesticated the horse. And it's likely that they believed in a sky god, which they described as the Sky Father, and they passed stories of the sky god down along their history using song poetry. These very ancient people believed in another world too, another world that was guarded by a watchdog and could only be reached by crossing a river. They may also have believed in a world tree that bears the fruit of immortality and is guarded by a serpent or dragon. So the world tree that is guarded by a serpent or dragon is most likely the earliest folk memory of what we call the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life. They believed that the world was tended by 3 goddesses who spun the thread of life. And the same ideas became quite popular in the early civilization in Greece. Proto-Indo-Europeans also had a creature they called the striker, and he was like a flying god with a hammer, who's akin to the later Thor. They also had a water god named Apam Napat, who's a figure that probably inspired the later Roman god Neptune and the old Irish water god Nectane. And they had animistic deities, for example elves and nymphs. It's from these very ancient beliefs, from beliefs of prehistoric people over 4,000 years ago, that our image of a wandering wizard emerges, and Wōden is first seen and first described. By the way, it's interesting to note that well into the 12th century AD, and long after Norway had become officially Christianized, Odin, or Wōden, was still alive and well and being invoked by the Nordic population. And in fact, even in more recent times, I'm told that if a person is woken by an odd noise at night, they tend to declare that Odin is passing by in his chariot. Anyway, I thought I'd try to offer some background to the figure Merlin and the later wizards, and especially Gandalf, but also the Doctor of Doctor Who stories and Dumbledore. And it seems they all come from one very ancient, very, very ancient folk belief. It's buried so far deep into our memory that even an invocation of the powerful figure of Wōden the Wanderer is enough to excite us. Locus in quo, the Roman roads of Britain. Last week I mentioned in very fast passing that I live quite close to a Roman road which passes by our town. And I promised I'd cover Roman roads in Britain. Listeners from outside Europe, especially those from the continent of America or from Australasia, will be unfamiliar with Roman roads. But here in Europe, they are a feature of our topography, and most Europeans are familiar with the idea of a Roman road, and so are people from North Africa. Those of you who are watching Britannia, the fantasy TV series that's being aired on BBC right now, will be aware that the Romans came to Britain in 43 AD. This was the second time they came. Actually, came earlier with Julius Caesar, but retreated. Anyway, in 43 AD, they set up the port at my hometown in Staines on the River Thames, which they called Themisis, and they stayed here in Britain for, well, nearly 400 years, until 410 AD. In Britannia, as in their other conquered provinces, the Romans constructed a network of paved trunk roads to march upon. And at this period in their history, the Romans, especially Roman soldiers, hated horse riding. I know it sounds and feels odd to us now because we put cavalry as an important and integral part of an army now, and we think about the US cavalry coming to the rescue of people. And it's a common mistake in TV shows and movies that the Romans are often seen, especially their senior officers, are often seen riding around on white steeds. But in fact, the Romans at this period in their history disliked horse riding, disliked horses, and in fact only non-Roman auxiliaries, people who were born outside the Roman Empire, almost enslaved people, were the only cavalrymen, and they were looked down upon by the rest of the troops. Anyway, because they liked to march everywhere, the Romans liked long, straight, reliable roads. And they had a way of marching which they knew they could knock out quite a few miles every single day. And so they marched in their legions, which is about 5,000 men, divided into several cohorts, what we would consider to be a reliable, properly constructed road. Now, up till this point, prior to the Roman conquest of Britain and prior to the conquest of Europe before the Romans, merchants had to use unpaved trackways, and these included ancient trackways which ran along the top of ridges normally. So if you came to Britain prior to the Roman conquest, you would have found very few, if any, paths and tracks. Two things to bear in mind when you're thinking about pre-Roman Britain. Two things to remember. The first is that almost all of Britain was a forest. Even when William the Conqueror came, most of Britain, 9/10 of Britain, was a deep thick forest. And of course the forest is a dangerous thing to travel through. So merchants, prior to Roman roads, wanted to traverse along the higher ridges away from the dark and scary forest floor. And the other thing they would probably do is they would probably follow routes that were trod down by herds over generations, known nowadays as drovers' routes. But they might have been trod down by deer or cattle. And often these deer or cattle ways went along kind of steep slopes, almost around marshes, up and across valleys, in very odd ways. But one thing they did do was they tended to go reasonably straight. And it's possible, and I'll go into this in more detail in another show, but it's possible that these herd ways were one way of describing ley lines. But we'll go back to that later. So prior to the Roman conquest of Britain, merchants had to use unpaved trackways, and some of these are still in use, and one is quite famous. It's known as the Ridgeway, which is in Cotswolds and Chilterns. It's quite a long route. These were long-distance footpaths, like ancient prehistoric motorways, if you like. A little bit too difficult to drive a cart along, but certainly they were. You could take a pack horse across it, and normally you would walk across it. So the Romans set out almost at once to create an all-weather network of roads that was completed by 180 AD. They called the roads streets. The word street comes from the word paving. So the main streets, there were a few smaller ones, but the main streets were Deer Street, which led from York to the Antonine Wall in Scotland. Ermine Street, which is quite famous, it's the A1, which ran from London to Lincoln, which used to be called Lindum Colonia, via York. Fosse Way, which linked Exeter, Isca Daemonologie, to Lincoln, Lindum Colonia. And Watling Street, that ran from Londinium to the port of Dover. Like I said, there were a few smaller roads, and where I live on the Thames at Ad Pontes, we live between the Portway and Akeman Street. Portway runs from London to Dorchester, and Akeman runs from London to Gloucester, which is Gelvin, the Roman roads of Britain. Fantasy writers' definitions. This week, Chekhov's gun. So this month, thousands of writers, both new and old, me included, are diligently writing their 50,000 plus words novels as they participate in the NaNoWriMo challenge. It might be a bit too late to bring Chekhov's gun to these writers' attention, but nevertheless it's an important and useful rule of thumb that can be used by fantasy fiction writers. So, who's Chekhov? Well, Chekhov is a Russian playwright and short story writer. He was a doctor as well, Dr. Anton Chekhov, 1860 to 1904. And he came up with an important dramatic principle for his plays and for his short stories. And it's this: every element in a story must be necessary and irrelevant elements must be removed. So let's go through that in more detail. Every element in a story must be necessary. So, if an element is removed, the structure would fall apart. If you took away a retaining wall in a house, the house would fall down. If you took away a window in a house, the house would still stand up. If you took away the roof of a house, it wouldn't be a house anymore, it would just be an enclosure. Every element in a story must be necessary in the same way. And the second part of Chekhov's gun is this: irrelevant elements must be removed, or they might be seen to be making false promises to the reader or an audience. The gun in Chekhov's gun refers to Chekhov's statement, which is as follows. He said this in Russian, by the way, but I'm going to translate it into English for you. If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, then the gun must go off. If it's not going to be fired, it has no right to be hanging there. So likewise, if you bring a loaded rifle into your story, it must be fired by the end of the story, because it's wrong to make promises that you don't mean to keep. Ernest Hemingway, who's one of my favourite authors, liked to contradict this rule, and he contradicted on several occasions. And he said he valued the inconsequential details in his writings. But even Ernest Hemingway conceded that readers would inevitably seek symbolism and significance in those moments. So in some ways he agreed with Chekhov that it's wrong to make promises that you don't mean to keep. So thinking about your own story, especially if you're working on NaNoWriMo right now, and using the principle of Chekhov's gun, do you have any guns on walls that serve no purpose? And if you do, why don't you get rid of them? For example, does one of your heroes or supporting characters have a special magic ring or a invisibility cloak that's not used? Does he or she have a magical power that's not utilised? Or does he or she have some deep mystical knowledge that is never mined? Does an animal or a creature have some magical or amazing power, but we never get to see them use this power? So if you've got any of Chekhov's guns in your story, erase them now before they weaken your story structure. Last week I mentioned that the male equivalent of a witch is a warlock, and this was the word that had been used to describe the male counterpart to witch Samantha Stevens in the 1960s television show Bewitched. A warlock is defined as a person, typically male, who uses magic for or against others. So a warlock is different to a wizard. A wizard is a otherworld creature, possibly a deity, a wanderer, who has huge physical and mental power, but a warlock is defined as a person who uses magic for or against others. There's no suggestion that this person isn't anything other than a human. The word derives from the Old English word warloga, Waerloga, which means oathbreaker or deceiver, so it has the darkest of origins. The Old Norse word Vardlokkur, Vardlokkur, means caller of spirits, and it's also been suggested that this could be a root word, although this has been argued against. Anyway, although most victims of the witch trials in early modern Scotland were women, what is less well known is that some of the men who were executed as witches were warlocks. Witchcraft has such a long and fascinating and complex history, and it has a history that goes back to long before the Bible, that I think the subject deserves special attention, so I intend to examine witches and witchcraft in considerably more detail in the new year over a series of special shows. But for now, I just want to concentrate on warlocks and what a warlock is, because I mentioned it last week. And I wanted to explain to you about the Scottish witch trials in early modern Scotland. So, in 1589, King James VI and First, who was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, visited Denmark, where witch hunts were common. And on his long sea voyage from Scotland to Denmark, he encountered rough seas and storms that were said to be the result of magic. It's also reported that at least one of his ships was sunk. It was said to be the one that contained valuable gifts for his queen, because it was lost in the ferocious storm. Upon his return to Scotland, he attended the North Berwick witch trials, which were the first major persecution of witches in Scotland. And after he witnessed the trial of the witches who had caused his ships to be struck by waves and winds, he set up a royal commission to hunt down any other witches in his realm, and he recommended torture when dealing with witch suspects. The Scottish schoolmaster, Dr. John Fian, was accused of bewitching townsfolk and preaching witchcraft, and along with Agnes Sampson and others, he was accused of raising storms to sink the fleet of King James VI of Scotland. He was the first of a few warlocks that were tried and sentenced later for witchcraft. Dr. John Fian endured having his fingernails forcibly extracted and his feet mangled in screw-down torture boots that were known as pillywinks. These instruments of torture crushed his feet until they were no longer usable. It's said he endured his torture without expressing any pain. He was taken to Castle Hill in Edinburgh, where he was strangled and burnt on the 27th of January 1591. As far as we know, the first warlock executed for witchcraft. John Stuart, Earl of Mar and Garioch, the youngest son of James II of Scotland, who himself was imprisoned and probably killed at Craigmillar Castle, was likewise accused of being a warlock by King James VI, and he was arrested for treason. King James VI was responsible for a book known as Daemonologie. Incidentally, Daemonologie is spelled Daemonologie, demon, as in Philip Pullman's way of spelling. It was a textbook which focused on necromancy and the historical relationships between the various methods of divination and black magic. The textbook also touched on werewolves and vampires. And it's interesting to think that a book on demonology will be published before an authorised version of the Bible. I shall discuss Daemonologie, this textbook, in more detail in a future show. But it's worth noting now that William Shakespeare is said to have used Daemonologie as his source book when he was writing and producing his Scottish play. Don't listen if you're a dramatist now, but I'm going to name the Scottish play Macbeth. John Napier of Merchiston, who was around 1550 to 1617, was a famous mathematician, physicist and astronomer. He invented the much-hated log tables, aka logarithms, that have been disliked by school kids of a certain age for generations. And he was born and died in a castle, and he dabbled in alchemy and necromancy and magic. In fact, John Napier kept a black rooster as a familiar. And John Napier is widely known to be, and professed himself as, quite proudly, a warlock. But during the European Age of Enlightenment, which was the 18th century, when science became more prominent and the philosophy of science became talked about, belief in the powers of witches and sorcerers and warlocks gradually began to die out, and warlocks and reports of warlocks became rarer. Wildflower of the week. This week, the wake robin. So, Trillium erectum, the wake robin, or Beth root, or also known as stinking Benjamin, is a quickly fading plant from the Trillium family. The Trilliums are perennial herbs grown from rhizomes, and they have 3 large leaf-like bracts that, in the case of the wake robin, are red in colour. These bracts look like petals, but they're not. They're photosynthetic, and they're brightly coloured. So although they resemble flowers, they're actually more closely related to leaves. Between the 3 large leaf-like bracts, there are much smaller flowers. These small flowers are carrion scented. They smell of rotting meat, hence the common name Stinking Benjamin. And the idea of this is that they will attract scavenging flies for pollination. Eventually the flower petals wither and that leaves behind a fruit that ripens into a dark red berry. Trilliums are native to eastern United States of America and eastern Canada, so don't bother trying to look for them in a European woodland. The root was traditionally used as an aid in childbirth, hence the name Beth root, which of course is a corruption of birth root, and Native Americans would use the root for menstrual disorders or to induce childbirth and to aid in labour. According to Buckland's book of Gypsy Magic, you can attract a lover with a pinch of wake robin. All you need to do is use a pinch of the herb in whatever you're cooking, and it will cause your lover to be drawn to you in a very strong and very positively romantic way. Wildflower of the week, the wake robin. As you can hear, I'm still suffering a bit from a head cold and my voice is a bit crackly and it's difficult to actually do the podcast this week again. Next week I'm preparing to go to Cornwall, right down in the south, the Duchy of Cornwall. If you remember my show a couple of weeks ago about the difference between a duchy, a county and a shire. So I'm going down to the Duchy of Cornwall and hopefully I'm going to be visiting the place where the Lady of the Lake hung out. So I'll be able to report about the Lady of the Lake, and also I'll be hopefully seeing some other interesting myth and magic sites. And then the week after that I'll be travelling to Rome. So I'll be doing a bit of a report directly from Rome. So things will be very busy for me over the next couple of weeks. If you need to contact me whilst I'm away, you can tweet me at Neilmach, all one word, Neilmach. And don't forget to go to my website, which is Neilmach, all one word again, neilmach.me, M-E, which not only has a lot about me as an author, but also has some show notes from some previous shows, and hopefully I'll be able to put this show notes from this show and more recent shows on as well. They're a little bit late at the moment. Also, don't forget to like me on Facebook at author.neilmach, Neilmach, author.neilmach, and I'll see you next time.